Hello and welcome. You're watching Macros with Mythili, where we take a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues facing the country. Today we're going to take a hard look at a very specific issue that at one level seems far removed from macroeconomics, but it is an issue which has huge macroeconomic implications. India's IPR, or Intellectual Property Rights regime, in the context of the US government's recent announcement to retain India on the priority watch list and not name us as a priority foreign country, which would then allow the US to impose trade sanctions on India. What was the provocation for the US Special 301 report, on the basis of which the US Trade Representative made this announcement? Is the US government being driven by the interests of MNC pharma companies that only want to protect their bottom lines, regardless of what it means for human lives? Is our IPR regime not WTO compliant? To discuss this, I am joined by Pradeep Mehta, Founder Secretary General of the Jaipur-based CUTS, that has been at the forefront of pioneering work in the area of trade, WTO, and trade-related intellectual property rights, TRIPS, and G.D. Shah, Secretary General of the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance, a group of research-based pharma companies. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Pradeep, if I may just start with you, what does the US decision really mean? What does it imply in terms of Indo-US trade? Is it that the issue has only been put on the back burner temporarily, or is it once and for all sorted out?
The action by the USTR is itself baloney, and it is plain and simple bullying for the point which you made, that it is the pharmaceutical companies which are pushing their government to put India on the priority watch list or what have you. Our IPR regime is fully compliant with the TRIPS agreement, and therefore we have really nothing to be afraid about. And why can't they raise a dispute in the WTO, which they are entitled to?
Mr. Shah, Pradeep just talked about the USTR's actions being basically bullying of India. Now, IPR encompasses so many things: copyright, trademarks, patents, but it is the issue of pharma patent particularly that has brought this issue to the forefront. What exactly is it that US pharma companies have against India's patent regime in the context of pharmaceutical products?
Essentially, what the US pharmaceutical companies want is that we have got one Section 3D in the Patent Act, which does not permit second and third patent for the same molecule unless the molecule gives significant enhancement in the efficacy, which means the treatment period or treatment cost is reduced. Now, second and third patent for the same molecule would mean the patent life will go up from 20 years to 25, 30, 35, 50 years. Now, is India ready, considering the burden of disease in the country and the resources that we have, that do we adopt this US regime of IPR in India? An answer obviously is no, that India fought for this in the TRIPS, and these flexibilities are given to all the TRIP member countries, that they can define what is patentable. So this is one issue. Second issue is one compulsory license that India granted, because out of 15,000 patients, only 200 patients were being served by Bayer for an anti-cancer drug. And the cost of medicine was about $70,000 US, whereas an Indian company offered to make it available at 8,000 rupees, the same medicine. Now, India had to choose between either letting people die because they could not afford the Bayer's medicine, or let an Indian company make it and provide it. Now, these are two critical issues on which the US pharma companies are bullying India through USTR.
Pradeep, Mr. Shah just talked about how pharma companies are, pushing the US government into bullying India. Can you just tell us a little bit about WTO requirements under TRIPS, and what are the flexibilities that it allows countries in terms of their IPR regimes to be WTO compliant and yet look after their own domestic interests?
Mythili, let's get into the history of TRIPS. The whole issue of intellectual property rights was brought into the trading regime in the year 1995 because of a push by the US pharmaceutical companies and, of course, the European pharmaceutical companies as well. And if you remove TRIPS from the WTO, then perhaps the US would walk out. But that's just to explain to you the significance of the TRIPS agreement. Having said that, the kind of negotiations which took place in drafting and crafting the TRIPS agreement, we had to put in a lot of safeguards. And these safeguards allows a country to take steps to deal with anti-competitive measures. So if you look at our patent laws or copyright laws, they are all WTO compliant. Secondly, the Doha summit, which was held in the year 2001, or is it 2000, had launched the Doha development round. And what also happened simultaneously was another declaration and an agreement on TRIPS and public health, which, to give you an example, is not only that India can manufacture any such drugs which are required in public interest to protect public health, but there was a special agreement at Doha to allow such countries which do not have manufacturing facilities to import such drugs from countries which can sell it to them, which can manufacture and sell it to them in a legally compliant manner.
Mr. Shah, Pradeep was just putting the IPR regime in the context of TRIPS. But the fact is that pharma companies claim, and this is in some way genuine also, that they have to spend millions of dollars to discover a new drug. At the end of it, if their patent rights are not going to be protected, then where does that leave them? So how does one balance the interest of pharma companies and that of the public at large, particularly in poor countries where access to medicines, particularly life-saving medicines, is very critical?
Look at the available evidence. 88% of the sales of multinational companies come from regions where only 18% of the population lives, that is America, Europe and Japan. They contribute 88% of sales. And where 82% of the population lives, which includes Australia, Africa, Asia, including China, India and Russia, they contribute only 12% of sales. Now, is their R&D cost covered by sale to 88%? And secondly, India has never been asking that we will not respect your intellectual property right. That's not the position. India's position is that in those drugs where if you do not introduce a differential pricing and make it affordable for people of India, India will be compelled to use this compulsory license. And as a result of this, what has happened in case of Bayer? Not only its total sales after the compulsory license in India has gone up, but NATCO, who has been granted a compulsory license, is also paying royalty to Bayer for people who could not afford Bayer's medicine. So net-net, the innovative companies are not losers.
Welcome back to Macros with Mythili, where we're discussing the special 301 report of the USTR and what does it mean for India, particularly in the context of patents in the pharma sector. Pradeep, just before the break, you were speaking about how our IPR regime is entirely WTO compliant. And you also mentioned earlier that the US is taking unilaterally action. So tell me, why doesn't the US, if it has problems with our IPR regime, take us to the dispute settlement board? That is my first question. And my second question really is that why don't all the countries whose interests are also hurt by this gang up together against the US and act in their common interest?
Well, Mythili, on your first question, why does the US not take it to the WTO dispute settlement machinery? Because legally there is no case. They would probably lose the dispute if in case they brought it forward. And on your second question about the kind of affected countries ganging up together, could also happen in the event the US wants to bring a dispute in the WTO. But it's a very complex world. If you look at the US bilateral investment treaties across the world, about 130 of them have all TRIPS plus commitments. Even the existing Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which they are negotiating with a large number of East Asia and other Asian countries, minus China, they are trying to push a tougher regime on IPRs, and that's one of the reasons why this will not happen. What I would suggest to the government of India is to do a similar report. You don't, against the kind of barriers which the US is bringing against Indian exports. For example, on movement of natural persons, the new Immigration Act makes it difficult for even our software personnel to go into the US. I mean, we require to face the bully and to call the shots. I mean, in the sense that to call the bluff. And that is what I would like to suggest.
Mr. Shah, before the break, we were talking about the two cases really that brought this entire issue to the front burner. And I think as far as the IPR regime in India is concerned, there are two particular clauses. One is about compulsory licensing, and the other is Section 3D of the Patent Act, which talks about efficacy of the new drug. Which of these two do you think is a more potent one, and which one do you think the US is more unhappy about? And why?
It's Section 3D which it is unhappy, because they want second, third, fourth patent for medicines which were patented more than 20 years ago, so that they can continue to extend the life. The whole approach of some of the US companies, I will not blame the entire pharmaceutical, US pharmaceutical industry, but companies like Pfizer, which are driving this agenda, and they do not have anything new in the pipeline. So it has adopted a policy of litigation vis-a-vis innovation. And this is the approach which USTR is pressurized to do and put India or downgrade India. If you permit me to respond to the second question that you asked, Pradeep, India has been a soft country, and we do not realize our strength. One only hopes that new government comes back and, in fact, puts a condition to Pfizer, to USTR and the US, that some of your concerns could be addressed, provided you remove India from the watch list altogether, from Super 301, and give them a time limit. Because today, US needs India more than India needing US. If you look at the defense supplies to India, you look at their Boeings which are being supplied to India, the infrastructure investment which is coming from US, and US needs this market. And this strength we must realize ourselves, and the government needs to address accordingly and talk from a position of strength, which it has started talking in the last. And this strength we must realize ourselves, and the government needs to address accordingly and talk from a position of strength, which it has started talking in the last couple of months.
If I can ask you a supplementary question on that, Mr. Shah, is evergreening of patents, is it an endemic problem with patents? And do other countries also have a similar clause like Section 3D?
A few more countries, and the latest being Australia, which has passed an act which says raising the bar. The name of the act itself indicates that they've raised the patenting bar so that they do not grant such frivolous patents. The absence of a similar provision has been commented by a report in the EU, which said that this evergreening of patents has led to, and this is an official document from European Commission, delayed the access to generic medicines, because then companies tried to keep the patents alive for more than 20 years, as in the case of Glivec, for instance, in USA, with second and third patent, the Glivec monopoly would remain for 30 years. Now, this is a choice which India has to make, that do we want to allow this sort of patenting, or do we say we stick with our obligations under TRIPS, 20-year period, and if you can really improve a drug significantly, which can reduce the treatment period or treatment cost, sure, we can grant a second patent on that, but not merely because of some convenience of dosage or heat-stable medicine.
Pradeep, the shift in India's patent laws from process to product patent is quite old now, and in fact the entire thing about compulsory licensing etc. was tested during the times of the AIDS epidemic, when Indian pharma manufacturers exported in a huge scale to the African continent, and that time it seemed to pass muster. So why do you think this controversy has arisen now? Is it because US pharma interests are more fearful that our domestic pharma industry is becoming more competitive?
That is one reason.
I think you made the point. I mean, the U.S. pharma sector is certainly very afraid of the kind of competition which they'll get from the Indian pharmaceutical sector. And the fact is that, as I said earlier, when negotiating the TRIPS agreement, there was a hard battle to craft all these safeguards. Now, compulsory licensing is a right of a country to use. Now, let me tell you, now, a lot of people do not know, but even the US has a law which allows compulsory licensing in the area of clean technologies. They have not used it, but that's another point. And we could, in theory, under the TRIPS agreement, we could also address the issue of accessing technology, and particularly considering the kind of impact which climate change is happening. So why only pharmaceuticals? In the event that there is a clean technology available somewhere which the seller is not willing to give on reasonable terms, or what we call fair, reasonable and non-discriminatory terms, then the government of India can also use the same safeguard to ensure that clean technology is available to Indian manufacturers to deal with problems of pollution and so on and so forth.
Okay, so the US is clearly pointing a finger at us when it itself is quote-unquote guilty of having the same provision on its books. But on that note, we'll slip into another short break, but please do stay with us. You're watching Macros with Mythili. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the entire US Special 301 report, particularly in the context of the pharma IPR regime. Mr. Shah, if I could ask you, we just discussed about compulsory licensing and Section 3D efficacy. Then how is it these same pharma companies seem to have gone along with the DPCO, the Drug Price Control Order? Why is it that they have no objections, quote unquote, to that? What explains this apparent inconsistency?
Well, US is the only country in the world which has no formal price control. And this very concept they are not comfortable with. That's why they do not want any sort of price control in India. Now, India has only two tools. Either use compulsory license to create a competition, and competition will drive the prices down, or rely on price control so that medicines, particularly patented medicines, are available or accessible to the people who cannot afford it. And both of these US pharma companies are against these provisions in India. But at the moment they are focused only on the IPR. That's why they are not talking so much about, and India has also not taken action on pricing of patented products. Though committee has been there for last 7-8 years, That's why you're not hearing much about the pricing.
Pradeep, as far as the Indian IPR regime is concerned, we were talking so far all along patents and pharma, but there are other US companies, and particularly companies like Boeing, Honeywell, in fact even Abbott Laboratories, which is a pharma company, which seemed quite satisfied with the Indian IPR regime. In fact, their submissions to the USTR said that they were quite happy. So what explains this contradiction? Is it that the US corporates themselves are divided on the issue, and are pharma companies, is there a quiet battle going on between US corporates themselves?
I think Dilip Shah pointed out that they look at India as a big market, and therefore I completely agree with Dilip Shah when he says that India needs, I beg your pardon, US needs India more than we need them, and therefore rightly so these three large corporates, including Abbott, which is a pharma company, has found the Indian IPR regime fair and reasonable. I think that proves the point. It's not a question of being divided. I think it's a question of what they see as their own potential, so that they at least do not rub the government of India on the wrong side.
So at the moment, this seems to have been driven more by political interest, because the US government is wary of rubbing any new government that might come to power the wrong way. Would you agree with that assessment, Mr. Shah? And in closing, because we're near the end of our program, do you think our IPR regime needs to be recast in any way? And if so, what would you suggest is via media, so that we do not have these kind of tussles with the US?
Let me first correct that it's not driven by political interest. It's driven entirely by commercial interest of a few corporations in the US. And even those corporations which are supporting India's IPR regime are also driven by their commercial interest. That's one. Secondly, if the USTR wants a dialogue with India, they must first remove even this rollover which they have announced, that we would review after 6 months in the fall of 2015. You can't hold a gun and say, now you negotiate with us. Sit down. There are few issues where US concerns can be addressed, and out of 5 or 6 major demands, at least 2 or 3 should satisfy them. But US will have to accept the basic structure of Indian patent law, that compulsory license and Section 3D, which prevents evergreening, cannot be compromised. And this is the only way to build on a strategic relationship between the two countries.
Okay. Pradeep, so let me turn to you for the final word. Should we worry about this threat of an out-of-cycle review? And do you agree with Mr. Shah that there might be some sections where perhaps we could cede a little bit of ground to the US? Or should we just, stick to our ground and say nothing doing, we are not going to change our IPR regime, you have more to gain from this, and we have a large poor population to worry about? What would your final take on this be?
I don't think we need to do anything with our IPR regime. And the best is, let the US challenge it in the WTO, and in the event that the dispute panel finds that some of the provisions in our IPR laws are violative of the provisions of TRIPS, then we can look into it. Secondly, Mythili, more importantly, US is also talking about entering into a bilateral free trade and investment agreement with India. So let's not forget that the US has much at stake. And if you ask me, it is the US which is more hungry for a bilateral treaty with India, in as much as the European Union is. Even the EU-India FTA is stuck on various issues, and one of them is on IPRs itself. So people do realize that, look, we are not a banana republic to be bandied about. I'm not worried about this USTR report putting us on priority watch list and so on. And as I said earlier, I think India should produce a report on the US itself, not as a tit for tat, but the fact is that we do have a lot of unfair barriers which the US erects for our own exports. And that is when we can come to a common ground to start talking about resolving disputes or resolving differences among each other.
Well, yes, I entirely agree with you. We are no banana republic, and though we can find common ground between the US and us, there is no reason why we should fear that the US can impose trade sanctions on us, because our IPR regime is entirely WTO compliant. So on that note, we come to the end of this program. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me and sharing your views.